actually they actually brought veteran soldiers who had seen war in Korea, in Nanking, China. So they brought these veterans to Iloilo for the sole purpose of doing the punitive drives. And these soldiers, they you know they had seen enough killing that they were so desensitized to the killing. So over in Iloilo, the Ilonggos term the punitive drives as the juez de cuchillo. And the photograph that you see there, again, I'm not quite sure if this is in Panay, but that is an execution detail. So those Filipinos, they could be guerrillas, they could be civilians, they're being prepared to be beheaded. And images like these became more and more familiar as the punitive drives went on. And this particular building, which you will find it's a mansion. I think, trying to remember the last name. Sorry, I forgot what the last name of the owners. Villanueva, I think. Villanueva. Not quite too sure of that. I think it's the Villanueva mansion. Just correct me if I'm wrong. I apologize for that. But it's in front of what used to be the BJMP, the prison in Iloilo. And it's a perfect spot actually, because if you have a prison which the Japanese could use, Bawan Gimbal, San Joaquin, Miagao, and it lasted for 40 days. And over at San Joaquin, for instance, I was able to interview someone who narrated how the Japanese went into town, gathered people around who were very curious as to why the Japanese were there, and then just started killing them, mowing them down. And when they were done with it, they threw the bodies over into the wells, into a well right next to the church, and many people who were still alive drowned in that well. The second phase, the second drive, was headed towards the north, Barotac, Pototan, towards those places. And the third drive was in October, and it was directed towards Capiz. And the main point of the punitive drive is just to punish. Punitive punish it was just to punish the guerrillas for what they did. The idea, of course, is that if you terrorize the population so much, the guerrillas would realize that any action they took had a toll, right? So for every action that they did, the civilian population was going to suffer, and it would deter them from taking any other military action against the Japanese. I'd like to relate rather very sad and gruesome story about the campaign towards the north. I think this happened in Barotac Viejo, right, if I remember correctly. And it's a story that I find really interesting, because I've heard it so many times from many different sources, but it was never written down in any history book, or any history source. So I heard it when I was like a grade 1 student. Then I heard it when I was a grade 6 student from another source. I heard it again when I was in high school, again when I was doing my master's thesis, and then a couple of years back, about 2015, I heard it again from another source, across generations in different places in Iloilo, and they were talking about the exact same thing. And what actually happened was that during the punitive drives, the wife of a Yusufe soldier, a Panay guerrilla, the wife of a Panay guerrilla, in some versions, she was supposed to be an arrogant rich woman, right, who had a bad habit of being an addict for mahjong. In some cases, she was just this kind old lady who was, who liked playing mahjong too much. But she would bring her daughter, 12-year-old daughter, to town, right, and would play mahjong all day long. And then someone had warned her, that her name had been reported to the Japanese, and she was in danger of being arrested because they knew that her husband was a Panay guerrilla, right, Yusufe soldier. And so they warned her not to attend the mahjong session, but she brushed it aside. And then on that very same day, the Japanese came and dragged her out to a place, right? Remote place outside of town, but where people could still see. Um, and they accused her of being the wife of a Panay guerrilla, and they forced her to reveal where her husband was hiding. Her husband was actually in the vicinity, was hiding behind the bushes with their son, right? with his son. So there were four of them, the married couple, and then a boy and a girl, right? So the father was with the son, and the mother was with the daughter, and he was being tortured, he was being beaten, but she wouldn't say where the husband was, and so what the Japanese did was they stripped her naked, and then they tied her legs between two trees or two poles or something like that, and they ran a katana across her belly such that her blood and her entrails spilled over her face, and she was screaming right before she died. Her daughter was stripped naked, and all the Japanese soldiers who were present reportedly raped her, this 12-year-old girl, and the father, who had been hiding with the son, had seen all this unfold, couldn't do anything. She couldn't possibly stand against something like 40 soldiers. He couldn't do anything, but he was with his son, and the son supposedly yelled something like "Papa si Mama, Papa si Mama." And then when he saw that the mother was being killed, he ran out of his hiding place, and the father tried to run after the son, but in doing so revealed his position as well to the Japanese soldiers. He was ID'd, and they were both summarily executed, including the son. And so the next day, when the guerrillas, investigated the place, the Japanese had already left. The guerrillas had investigated the place. A lot of the soldiers, a lot of the Panay guerrillas broke down. A lot of them were crying, and it was just, it was intense for them. Their comrade had lost his head. The son, a boy, had also been beheaded, lost his head as well. The mother, was hung up on the trees there, with her entrails sticking out, and the daughter had died from internal hemorrhage. For her thighs were so black from being raped that she suffered an internal hemorrhage, and she died. And so practically the entire family was dead. And that story being repeated over and over again from different sources was less likely to, again, by virtue of cross-reference triangulation, if you were doing oral history, so that couldn't have possibly been just a rumor, because you have various sources from various places, people who didn't know each other from across time, right? And the fact that it's still a story that's still being told today means that it affected everyone who had heard that story. And that is only one of the stories that you will encounter in the punitive campaigns. The hatred that Ilonggos had for the Japanese soldiers was primarily because of the punitive drives. The American community was massacred during the punitive drives. The Chinese community, after they had given food and shelter to the Japanese, it affected. They were burned in their huts. That story, and that is only individual people or entire communities massacred. So you have a trove of these accounts of the Japanese soldiers, the tortures, the horrors of the punitive drives, and their punitive fuel for the hatred the American community towards the Japanese, especially during the Chinese community. And they had given food and shelter the people to the who had perpetrated these atrocities, the Japanese soldiers who had perpetrated these atrocities, were actually outsiders. They weren't the garrison forces. Right? So they were outsiders who had been brought in to do specifically these punitive drives. But the people who suffered were, again, the civilians, the Ilonggo population, and the Japanese soldiers who were garrison forces. And a lot of them didn't have anything to do with the punitive drives, and they suffered because, well, the Filipinos, the Ilonggos, retaliated against them. All right. So now we go into the liberation period. Remember when we talked about the submarines, the query about can you find where we could land our submarines and list them according to preference? Well, these places were identified. So one of those was Pandan in Antique, Pandan Bay. It was deep enough, it was wide enough, and it was isolated enough. And so the Americans began sending their submarines. Several runs were made. Um, there were five, I think, five ships, right? Five ships. One, two, three, four, five. Yeah. So there were five ships that were reported as having doing these runs. Some of them doing the runs more than once, and they brought with them things like essential things like ammunition, weapons, but also food for the soul, food for the morale, you could say. Candies, chocolates, cigarettes, magazines from the United States. It's kind of like ways by which people were going to be assured that the Americans were really coming, that the Americans were really near. So it bolstered morale. But on one occasion, the USS Narwhal, the USS Narwhal was unloading. Excuse me. So the USS Narwhal was unloading. Its hatch was open. There were people, who were on the submarine trying to unload onto bancas, etc. And then suddenly a Japanese patrol boat appeared, shone a spotlight on them, saw them, and then retreated. Right. So they were going to be reported. Right. In fear of that happening, the USS Narwhal actually ran after the patrol boat with the hatch still open and then fired upon the patrol boat, eventually destroying it. But the case was really intriguing because it was, the one instance wherein a submarine had to engage with an enemy while its hatch was still open, and then, instead of under the sea, it was on the surface. All right, so now equipped with all their weapons, new uniforms even, on October 1944, there were guerrillas. One of them was someone I was able to interview. His name was Peter Ann, and Peter Ane. And Peter Ane and his friends were on top of a mountain in Antique, and they thought they could hear thunder. They thought they could hear thunder, but the sound of the thunder was really, really funny, really awkward. And so Peter ran up to the top of, the highest place on that mountain. And he looked towards Leyte and he reported seeing flashes of light, which at first he thought was lightning, but they didn't look like lightning. Actually, what he was witnessing was the Battle of Leyte unfolding. And, at that point, he was able to kind of like say the Americans really were here. Show's about to go down. And when the Americans, of course, were here, there was kind of like a corresponding guerrilla action as well. And so Peralta orders the resumption of offensive against the Japanese positions on the island. And before January, so you see October 1944, right? Leyte Gulf happens. By the time you get to January 1945, the Panay guerrillas were so successful in their actions that they had cleared the lowlands. And the only remaining places with Japanese presence were Tiring Airfield, Gimbal, and Gimbal, Tigbawan, and Iloilo City. Right? So Iloilo City, the capital, made perfect sense. But Gimbal and Tigbawan and Tiring Airfield. If you try to imagine that the Japanese forces were controlling only about 10%. During the course of the war, the Japanese only controlled 10% of the island, just certain areas where they were, which they found useful, and areas of centers of population. By the time you get to 1945, you only get 10% of that 10% that they were controlling. The guerrillas had actually diminished Japanese control so much that the Japanese soldiers were placed in a very, very desperate situation because they were being cordoned by the forces of the Panay guerrillas. There were already Japanese soldiers who had gone into hiding in the mountains of Maasin, and these remaining organized Japanese forces in in Gimbal, Tigbawan, in Tereng, and in Iloilo City, they needed to make a break for those mountains. Otherwise, they were going to be caught in the pincer move between the guerrillas and the Americans. And they were also in the coast. They were also on the coast, along the coastline, with the exception probably of Tereng Airfield. Iloilo City, Gimbal, and Tigbawan were within the reach of the American Navy. So if you stayed there, you were going to be blown to bits. And then a little bit more inland, when you get to February and March 1945, around about the time when the Americans were actually going to land in Iloilo, there were certain areas inland which the Japanese had still control over, that the Panay guerrillas wanted to knock out of Japanese hands. And so one of these places was in Haniway, right, which had pillboxes in both ends of the bridge. Some other places where the Japanese had pillboxes were in Cabatuan, the Tereng Airfield, and Santa Barbara, which had a reservoir. And there's a reason why those pillboxes were there. They're practically like the castles of medieval Europe. They're placed there because of strategic reasons. And so Haniway had two pillboxes on both ends of the bridge as kind of like two deterrents, because it was the access point to the outlying towns. And if while these pillboxes, while these strong points were in place, the Japanese could actually check traffic coming in and out towards Iloilo City. And so knocking that out was a priority for the Panay guerrillas. But, knocking them out just with small arms was like besieging a castle during the medieval ages as well. And so many people had actually died that by the end of the carnage, three of my informants were able to say exactly in the same way that when they would recount the aftermath of the battle for these pillboxes, they would shake their heads because of the sheer number of people who died fighting to get these two pillboxes. And those two pillboxes, they're practically ignored. People are passing by every day, not even knowing. A lot of people who are even from Haniway don't even know what those two structures are, and they pass it every day. But in 1945, those kind of like were the gateways to the outlying towns. Now here is a photograph which I'm not particularly proud of. What it is it shows Filipino guerrillas displaying as some kind of trophy a dead Japanese soldier. And the photograph, I think, was taken off of Tigbawan on the day of close to the liberation, the date of the liberation. So close to March 1945, the American Navy was bombarding the remaining garrisons of the Japanese. And so if you were a Japanese soldier inside Tigbawan, you were going to be bombarded. If you wanted to run from the bombardment, you had to cross a field and out, and you were displaying his body as a trophy, and personal letters. And so if this photograph would ever be seen by the family members of this person, the personal message to them is there in that piece of cloth, just being waved around as booty, right? Now, as the same thing was being done to Gimbal, the Americans had actually unleashed something like 120 shells, only to find out that, well, the number of the Japanese soldiers had diminished so much. There were actually only 15 soldiers guarding Gimbal, right? So by the time of the liberation, March 18th, the time of the landing, there were only very, very few Japanese left to actually make the surrender to the Filipinos and the Americans, to the Panay guerrillas and the Americans. I'd also like to tell you about this interesting case of Japanese civilians who had been, staying with the Japanese soldiers during the course of the war. So these Japanese civilians had migrated to Iloilo before the war. They just wanted to, make a name for themselves, find a living. But when the war happened, they were kind of like absorbed into the community of the Japanese soldiers. And then they became targets of the ire of Filipino guerrillas as well as Filipino civilians. And so when the Japanese tried to make a break for the mountains, these civilians went with them. And as the the Panay guerrillas were closing in on them, they became so scared. They wanted to surrender to the Americans because at least they would be assured that they were not going to be treated in the manner that this photograph is showing you. But it almost seemed inevitable that it was going to be the Filipino guerrillas, right, who were going to reach them first. And so, they committed mass suicide. They killed themselves instead of surrendering to the Panay guerrillas. And to me, that speaks a lot of the manner in which the Panay guerrillas had a reputation built up in such a way that their enemies would rather kill themselves than surrender to them, right? So what kind of reputation did they build up such that their enemies had no confidence that they were going to be treated humanely? Of course, the other argument is that the Japanese had done the same to them at some point, and the Filipinos were only returning the favor. And so, the Japanese kind of like also saw it coming. All right, so at 7:30 in the morning, the Americans landed over at Parara. The image you see there in the middle, you have civilians. Instead of gunfire, it was the civilians who greeted the American landings. Here you see a Willis jeepney being pushed by the local folk from Tigbawan, being pushed towards the highway. On the left and the right, you see the American push from Tigbawan towards the city. I think this photograph was taken close to where Arevalo is. And, when they reached Arevalo, they established a base there. They positioned their artillery in what is now Ramon Abansenia National High School, and it used to be a golf course, right? It used to be a golf course, so open field, and they positioned their artillery there. The Americans started bombing key positions in Iloilo City, so Japanese installations. And they started shelling Japanese positions as well. But, one of these bombs one of these areas which were being targeted was the Japanese headquarters, Japanese garrison over at Molo, and I believe it used to be positioned where Molo Supermart now is, right? But again, poor aim. One of the bombs, the structure was itself. How do you say this? The structure was left standing. The bombs completely missed the structure. It was still there. But the bombs had hit other houses, civilian houses. The intersection, for instance, of that barangay was turned into a crater, and the dust and the smoke had, it rose up and stayed there for a good hour or two. That people started calling the place Tapok, as in the dust, lifted. So henceforth, that barangay became called Tapok. And then one of the bombs blasted through. It bounced and then blasted through the church doors, but it didn't explode. And so religious people would look at it and say it was a miracle. But this one particular informant of mine, it was his father actually who had this experience, that the bomb fell right on his feet and started spinning and hissing wildly, and then stopped. And when everyone had regained their composure, they all ran out of the church, which was at that point in time serving as a refugee quarters, right? But after the war, the my informant's father, right? So the guy who had that bomb fall on his feet, refused to sit in any other position apart from that exact spot, because that is where kind of like, he said, God saved this life, right? It was actually the same bombing, the same artillery shelling, the same bombing that actually killed my own ancestors. So I don't have relatives on my family's, on my mother's side's family, because in 1945, on that day that the Americans were bombing the key places, the key Japanese positions, one of those bombs exploded right in the middle of my grand uncle's family. So my grand uncle was Chinese. He had migrated to the Philippines in the 1920s, and they were hiding in Molo Church. And when that bomb came into Molo Church, they ran out. And of course, when they ran out, there were more bombs there waiting for them. And as he was running with his family, his wife and children, and the household, basically, one bomb just fell in the middle of them, and they disappeared, right? So that bombing actually has a direct implication on kind of like everyone's history, and personally my own history, and so I kind of like I feel like I have a connection to the liberation period in that sense. All right, I think next slide, maybe we can go on. Okay, so when the Americans were moving up to try and get to the heart of Iloilo, the guerrillas were coming in from a different direction. The guerrillas had actually been in vehicles, right? And they were in a convoy, and U.S. airplanes had mistaken them for Japanese soldiers, and they were strafed. A bunch of guerrillas were killed by American friendly fire. But eventually, they were able to establish that they were not Japanese, and they began forming a cordon. So if you look at the image in front of you, you will see that the only way out of Iloilo was to travel north. Right, the only way out of Iloilo to get to Maasin, where the Japanese had their companions. To get there, it had to travel north. And so choking these points, to choke these points, you needed to guard them basically over at Haro and then at Molo, right? And the cordon from Molo extended all the way to Haro. And it is actually in Haro, on the eve of the 18th, when the Japanese began their breakout. The first wave was able to break out, but then when towards the 19th, getting towards the early hours of the 19th, the Japanese charged 7 times, but they were repulsed, and there were about 150 Japanese dead by the end of it. The guerrillas as well suffered their largest number of casualties in one given engagement. This was the time when they suffered the most number of casualties. There was actually a section that was nearly completely wiped out, which was why the Japanese were able to break out in their first attempt. But this particular engagement of trying to cordon the Japanese and trying to stop them from being able to reconsolidate in the mountains and put up a resistance was known as the Battle of Balantang. Okay, so the photograph actually is drawn from after the war, but I just wanted to use it to show to you that Calle Real, right, J. Mbasa now, Royal Street, Calle Real, practically remained intact. So much of the city had been destroyed, but this area remained intact. And one of the reasons why the area remained intact, it was preserved. It's a cultural site for us. It's a heritage site for Ilonggos today. was because the Ilonggos had taken an active action. How do you say this? They had taken they made an active effort in declaring, trying to inform the Air Force that and the Navy that the Japanese had already left. So you get actually two versions of this. One is that the Japanese puppet governor Fermin Karam had the letters "No More Japs" painted on the roof of his house, and the other one is that the nuns of Sagrado had taken all their bed sheets and their pillowcases and then formed them into letters saying "No More Japs," and so a Navy spotter plane had seen the letters and went back to base, went back to headquarters. It wrote down dozens and dozens of these messages, and then went to the places where they saw the signs and just dropped these messages. And one of these we were able to get hold of, and it says, "We got your message," and told headquarters, signed the Navy, right? So possibly the reason why there are two versions is because, well, there were two efforts. So it wasn't. I don't think of it as a case that only one made the effort, and you're trying to argue which one was the more genuine one, but rather that everyone was trying to make an effort, and these two were the most prominent efforts of trying to inform the Navy to stop them from bombing the city. So with the city intact, the Japanese now gone. They had now been able to, that remnant that had been able to break out towards Maasin. The Americans started flooding into the city. They marched into the city. You have many examples from there. I think on the lower left-hand side, you have Molo Church. That's the gazebo over at Molo Church. The upper right-hand side is where you have Assumption Convent now. And then on the lower right-hand side, you have the Customs House. But if you can see that old lady in the picture in the middle, like she's smiling and she's crying, I think that photograph encapsulates the feelings of Ilonggos. That the war was finally over for them. That is kind of like the sentiment that probably majority of the Ilonggos felt when the Americans had finally arrived. And here is probably a lesser known history which I would like to highlight. When the Americans were marching into the city, on that same parade, the Panay guerrillas also marched on parade. They also wore their uniforms. And if you take a look at their uniforms, they're very tattered. Some are in pants, some are in shorts. They look like the bad guys of a low budget, B movie action film. They had seen 3 years. They hadn't been to Iloilo City in 3 years. They had seen a lot of fighting. Their uniform was destroyed. They had to make do with whatever they had. But here they are marching into Iloilo with their pride and honor intact. And here is the Panay guerrillas marching into Iloilo after having liberated Iloilo, right? It wasn't that they relied on the Americans to liberate Iloilo. The Ilonggos liberated themselves. That is something I would like to highlight to later generations of Ilonggos as well. We have the potential to do this ourselves. On the afternoon of that day, Macario Peralta was awarded by Eichelberger wrap brush over there in a very kind of like how do you say this, in a very kind of like very rough cowboy in his very rough and cowboy uniform, as opposed to the nice suits, nice the uniform of Peralta and Eichelberger. Well, he was still wearing, Brush was still wearing his combat uniform. But Brush and Eichelberger were there to officially award Peralta with Distinguished Service Cross. And the house the house in front of where this ceremony was taking place is what today is the Bahay na Bato over in Villa, where you could go and have, a meal or some chocolate. So officially, on the day that Peralta was given the award, MacArthur declared the Iloilo City cleared of the Japanese. But it took several months before the Japanese actually surrendered. And so there were two ceremonies over at Maasin and over at Cabatuan at the Tireng Landing Field. And these were very, very well documented. So let me just quickly show you the slides of we have many photographs of this, the surrender ceremonies. Right. So most of these, so I think all of these were taken from Maasin. You can see the dam there, the river, and you can see the Japanese soldiers marching, right, from the jungles. They were marching up in order, and removing their arms, removing their weapons, surrendering their weapons, and then finally being processed before falling in line again to be officially declared as prisoners of surrenderies. There you go. Prisoners of war. There you go. This one is at the Tireng Landing Airfield. That image actually, the image at the top in the middle is on the actual airstrip. All right, now let's kind of end by talking about the Panay guerrillas and the main focus of this discussion, this lecture, which is on Kagitingan. So, in what ways did the Panay guerrillas make a difference? In what ways did they display Kagitingan? And how important were they actually to the course of the war? Well, to begin with, the Panay guerrillas were the most organized guerrilla unit in the entire Philippines during the course of the war. They were even the only, possibly the only band, the only guerrilla unit with its own marching band. If you take a look at, how do you say this? If you take a look at the image on the left, that's the time when Peralta was being awarded the Service Cross. You will see an honor guard, right? How do you say this? The honor guard is nakatanghalta, right? And he is wearing shorts, and that shorts actually, that uniform is the one you see there in the bottom, which is now in display at the Balanta Museum. And if you try to wear that uniform is actually very rough, and it makes your skin very itchy. It makes you very sweaty. It's uncomfortable. But the Panay guerrillas actually wore that. And that is an important thing because, it says something that the Panay guerrillas, whenever they would find themselves in a shootout with the Japanese soldiers would see them wearing uniform, right? So though you can see the idea, right? They were wearing uniforms to be able to tell that they were soldiers. They wouldn't just simply, fade into the background and mingle with the civilian population. These were soldiers declaring their uniforms as per the rules of engagement. And so even if they didn't have much capacity to make uniforms for them, Panay guerrillas were trying to do that, trying to get the semblance at least of order in terms of something as simple as the uniform. The Panay guerrillas had printing press. They had publications. They had the Mount Baloy Watchman, Flash, the Liberator, and these printing presses had to be hauled into the mountains in 1942. The Panay guerrillas also secured a front. They had secured food enough to last for 10 years. They were able to distill fuel from tuba, and they were able to have their own electricity. And the joke, of course, is that while Americans had engineering, the Ilonggo guerrillas had desponeering. Another important thing that the Panay guerrillas did was they provided a stalemate. They made the stalemate possible. without the stalemate, without being able to deter the Japanese from expanding inland, there could have been much more damage that was done on the island of Panay. Excuse me, especially to the civilians. You also have another feat here, which we just discussed, which was that they secured the lowlands way before the Americans had even arrived. And finally, the critical point is that for the rest of the Philippines, they were able to make a connection between the Filipino defenders and the Americans over at California and Australia. And therefore, they could serve as a liaison between the Americans and every other guerrilla unit in the country. So a friend of mine who's now since passed away, he said, I said, what if people don't believe that the Panay guerrillas were actually doing the fighting? Well, he said, I'll show you two pictures. I'll show you two photographs. So the first one is where you find Captain Chavez. He's now a much higher ranking officer. I think he's a colonel at this point. Julian Chavez, the defender of the rear guard, as they were doing, he was the one responsible for the falling line to prevent the Japanese from reaching division headquarters over at Mount Baloy. Well, that's him on the left-hand side, gesturing to the Americans which position they were going to attack together. And over on the right-hand side, you see Filipinos, you see Ilonggo, the Panay guerrillas there, making plans with the Japanese, going over a map and going over a list and, consolidating their forces. Although you don't really get to see actual photographs of the action, you have traces of the evidences of the actions that had taken place. These were the pre-combat operations. So these were the preparations that they made before they were going to engage in combat. And my friend said, well, if anyone still doesn't believe that, well, just point them towards the Balantang Memorial Shrine, where you will find 1,400 odd names of all our compatriots who never survived the war because they died fighting the Japanese. And of course, my friend has since died then, but his words still echo to my mind. If they don't believe you, just show them the wall. All right, so herein lies the question. What is Kagitingan? And then how do we exhibit it in this day and age? Now, if you try to find out what Kagitingan means, you'll see that it actually means something more than just bravery. It actually is more of a set of characters. It's about heroism, and heroism isn't just about one thing. It's about a series of things. It's more of an idea than simply one word. A hero embodies all the idealizations of good qualities idealized by any society. And so when you look for a hero, it's not just essentially about bravery. In fact, many of the soldiers who had participated in all these engagements, many of them were actually afraid. It wasn't that they were brave; they were really afraid. They were afraid as they were running blockades, as they were firing their weapons. They were afraid. And it is going through that makes them brave. But to say that they were brave per se, not really the case. So bravery is only one of the things about Kagitingan. Bravery is also standing up for, heroism is also about standing up for what you believe in and sticking to your guns, and staying there, believing in a cause, even when, it's failing. And you've seen that happen with the Panay guerrillas. They were defeated. They struggled. And eventually they won, right? So at certain points in time, they were never sure that they were going to win. They always thought that they were going to die, but they stayed anyway, right? So how do you exhibit something like that in this day and age? My students always ask, the greatest generation, the generation that took us through the war and then went through the reconstruction and even ended up going through the dictatorship, right? The greatest generation. How do you emulate? How do you try to live up to um, what they were doing, right? And to understand that, well, let me share something that a friend of mine had said a year ago, just as the pandemic was starting. Well, he said that, you know what? I think that the pandemic is our world war. This is our experience. This is the great trial of our time. This is the challenge of our age. And whatever we do here, however we conduct ourselves, uh, however we behave, however we react to things, this is the one that's going to be echoed down the line. This is going to be how the next generation is going to remember us. So we don't need to actually be in a shooting war to, you know, uh, be heroes. We are actually, as we speak today, we are actually being heroic in ways that we don't seem to acknowledge. So, to illustrate this point, I'd like to share an image which I found in over the internet when I was looking for visual aids for the slides. So, I started with an image of the Panay guerrilla, the um, idealized poster of a Panay guerrilla, and when I was going over the different versions of the Panay guerrilla, trying to find a good resolution, I found one which is kind of like an interpretation, a modern interpretation of the same poster, invoking the same message of the fighting Filipino. But whereas the Second World War Filipinos, the Second World War guerrillas were fighting for freedom, this generation of Filipinos are now fighting for lives. And in that way, we are in fact exhibiting heroism ourselves. And the way that we continue to deal with this pandemic will say much about our character as Filipinos and the way with which we exhibit our own brand of heroism. So, on that note, I'd like to thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed the lecture we had today. About our character as Filipinos and the way with which we exhibit our own brand of heroism. So, on that note, I'd like to thank you.
Ray Carlo Gonzalez. Ladies and gentlemen, this is where our morning session ends. The afternoon session will proceed at exactly 1 p.m. But while waiting, we have prepared a short activity where we encourage everyone to join.
In partnership with the Mount Samat Flagship Tourism Enterprise Zone, or FTEZ, we have prepared an online quiz bee for all of our participants today to further energize our minds.
This is called the Kagitingan Online Quiz Bee. This activity is part of the 79th Araw ng Kagitingan and Philippine Veterans Week commemoration programs of the Philippine Veterans Affairs in coordination with Mount Samat FTEZ. This is just the initial and a first in a series of online quiz bees and is considered as the easy round. There will be more online quizzes that will be conducted next time, so we hope that you'll be excited and anticipate the next one.
For the quiz bee mechanics and guidelines, first one, the coverage of the quiz bee includes selected information about the Second World War under the easy category. The quiz is open for all the participants that are present today here in Zoom. Secondly, the quiz is composed of 15 easy questions. Each question will be flashed on your screen and will be read twice. After each question, kindly use the chat box and type in your answers. Thirdly, while reading the question, the chat box will be disabled, and once done, it will be enabled for typing in your answers. A timer will be shown indicating the period when you can only type in your answers. After the timer stops, any answers will be automatically voided. The chat box will then be again disabled.
Number 4, participants have to key in the exact answer. It can be either a word, a term, a number, or a letter, as required and stated in each question. For answers that are names, terms, or words in general, please do not use shortcuts or abbreviations. Again, you must provide a complete answer with correct spelling. Number 5, the first participant who will be able to message the correct answer will receive 1 point. Participants who will earn 3 points will get a special prize and be declared as winner or winners. Each participant can only be awarded a maximum of 6 points and can receive 2 prizes. This will give chance to other participants.
Remember, the chat box will be enabled only after we read the questions and if there are any, the choices as well. Pay attention to the timer shown. The winner will be announced at the end of the quiz B. We will now begin first with a practice question. Here we go.
For our practice question, which country invaded the Philippines during 1941 to 1945? Again, which country invaded the Philippines during 1941 to 1945? Timer starts now. And stop. At this point, our facilitator will check the answers received and record whoever gets the point for the first question. The right answer is Japan. Does anyone have any questions? If there are none, we can now officially start our first Kagitingan online quiz B.
All right. Are you now ready? For our first question, during the closing stages of the Pacific campaign of World War II, the Japanese forces launched suicidal attacks by military aviators targeting Allied naval vessels or warships. What were the attacks called? During the closing stages of the Pacific campaign of World War II, the Japanese forces launched suicidal attacks by military aviators targeting Allied naval vessels and warships. What were the attacks called? A. Blitzkrieg. B. Kamikaze. C. Yamato. D. Torpedo. Timer starts now. And stop. So the correct answer is kamikaze.
For our second question, around how many soldiers were forced to join the Bataan Death March? Was it 16,000 soldiers or 76,000 soldiers? Again, how many soldiers were forced to join the Bataan Death March? Was it 16,000 soldiers or 76,000 soldiers? Timer starts now. And stop. So the correct answer is 76,000 soldiers.
So moving on to our third question. Which U.S. general was the overall commander of the U.S. Army, Navy, and Air Corps personnel in the Philippines when the Japanese invasion occurred? Was it General Arthur MacArthur or General Douglas MacArthur? Again, which U.S. general was the overall commander of the U.S. Army, Navy, and Air Corps personnel in the Philippines when the Japanese invasion occurred? Was it General Arthur MacArthur or General Douglas MacArthur? Timer starts now. And stop. So the correct answer is General Douglas MacArthur.
For our fourth question, true or false? Comfort women refer to the women and girls forced into sexual slavery by the Imperial Japanese Army in occupied territories during the World War II. Again, true or false? Comfort women refer to the women and girls forced into sexual slavery by the Imperial Japanese Army in occupied territories during World War II. Timer starts now. And stop. So the correct answer is true.
Moving on to our fifth question. Who organized the Hukbalahap? Again, who organized the Hukbalahap? Timer starts now. Yung mga choices. I'll repeat it. And stop. So the correct answer is Luis Taruk.
Moving on to our sixth question. Every year, Filipinos celebrate Araw ng Kagitingan. What is the exact month and day of the celebration? Again, every year, Filipinos celebrate Araw ng Kagitingan. What is the exact month and date of the celebration? Timer starts now. And stop. So the correct answer is April 9.
Wow. All right. Now for our seventh question. Which group of soldiers forced to do the Bataan Death March during World War II in the Philippines? Which group of soldiers forced to do the Bataan Death March during World War II in the Philippines? A. American and Japanese soldiers. B. Filipino and Japanese soldiers. C. Filipino and American soldiers. Or D. Filipino soldiers only. Timer starts now. And stop. The correct answer is C. Filipino and American soldiers.
Yes. For our eighth question, complete this famous statement of General Douglas MacArthur before he left the Philippines during World War II. I shall blank. Again, complete this famous statement of General Douglas MacArthur before he left the Philippines during World War II. I shall blank. Timer starts now. And stop. So the correct answer is return. He said, I shall return.
Moving on to our next question, our ninth question. During the World War, which Philippine city was declared as an open city? Again, during the World War, which Philippine city was declared as an open city? A. Cebu, B. Davao, C. Manila, or D. Quezon? Timer starts now. We still have five more questions. And stop. So the correct answer is Manila.
For our next question, the 10th question, who was the president of the Philippines when the Japanese invaded the country? Again, who was the president of the Philippines when the Japanese invaded the country? Was it A. Emilio Aguinaldo, B. Jose Laurel, C. Manuel Quezon, or D. Manuel Rojas? And the timer starts now. Three, two, and stop. So the correct answer is letter C, Manuel Quezon.
So we still have four questions left. Moving on to our 11th question. This is a true or false. Jose P. Laurel was considered as the president of the puppet government during the Japanese invasion of the Philippines. Again, Jose P. Laurel was considered as the president of the puppet government during the Japanese invasion of the Philippines. True or false? Start now. And stop. The correct answer is true.
Okay, now for our 12th question. What triggered the surrender of the Japanese and ended the war in the Pacific? Again, what triggered the surrender of the Japanese and ended the war in the Pacific? A, the bombing of Clark Field. B, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. C, the bombing of Manila. Or D, the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Timer starts now. And stop. So the correct answer is letter B, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
We still have last three questions. For our 13th question, which of the following provinces was not covered by the infamous Death March during World War II? Which of the following provinces was not covered by the infamous Death March during World War II? A. Bataan, B. Pampanga, C. Pangasinan, or D. Tarlac? Timer starts now. Okay, so the correct answer is Pangasinan.
Okay. For our 14th question, what does hukbalahap mean? Again, what does hukbalahap mean? Timer starts now. And stop. Okay, the correct answer is hukbo ng bayan laban sa Hapon?
Okay, since like we are enjoying this quiz B, but this would be our last question, guys. So the last question is, which refers to a member of a usually small group of soldiers who do not belong to a regular army and who fight in a war as an independent unit. Again, which refers to a member of a usually small group of soldiers who do not belong to a regular army and who fight in a war as an independent unit. A. Guerrilla. B. Kamikaze. C. Kempeitai. D. Makapiri. Timer starts now. Three, two, one, and stop. So the correct answer is A. Guerrilla.
Okay, that was fun. But at the end of our 15th round question, we now wait for our Kagitingan Webinar Secretariat to finalize the list of winners. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating on our first Kagitingan Online Quiz Bee, and we hope you participate again in our next round of Quiz Bees. So I believe we have our results.
Yes. So for we have three, right?
Okay, yes.
So Mr. Francis Villanueva got 2 points.
2 points.
For second place, Miss Jackie Alegre got 3 points. And lastly,
and our final winner is Dex Samarita with 5 points.
All right.
We
again,
congratulate the winners.
Congratulations, guys. Again, each winners will receive 100 pesos via GCash. Kindly message and submit your complete name, address, and contact number through the vmhd.customercare@pvao.gov.ph. Those who will be provided of books as mentioned by the FTES administrator will be emailed later on to claim their prizes.
So now, again, we thank you very much for joining our Quiz Bee, and we will see you again at 1 p.m. when we resume our symposium. Thank you very much.